During World War I, under 300 Russian female soldiers saw action on the Eastern Front in 1917. Yet Battlefield 1 have decided to include female soldiers in their latest DLC release in the name of the Tsar. A bold move and a great one by DICE in my opinion. I'm RebelScrappyCoco and this video is the first in a Battlefield 1 related history video series, the first being a special episode on the combat role of women during World War I. If you're a Battlefield 1 fan, you'll already know that the next DLC, called In the Name of the Tsar, focuses on the Eastern Front in World War I and is due for general release in early September. This is the first time ever in Battlefield history to have female soldiers in the multiplayer. When playing a scout on the Russian side, you play as a female. So how historically accurate is this bold move by DICE? And to what extent did women actually engage in combat in Russia or anywhere during the war? It is true to say that the lives of women across Europe during wartime dramatically changed. With regard to employment, with the eligible men all gone to war, the women found themselves drafted to work in the factories, on the farms, working as drivers and other forms of employment that men traditionally occupied. They were on the home front in most countries, keeping the endless supply of weapons, shells, ammunition, uniforms, etc. being sent to the various fronts to support the men on the front lines. The women in Britain worked in the munitions factories. They were called canaries, as the TNT turned their skin yellow. It was dangerous work. They also faced increased risk of being bombed by the German Zeppelins. Some women even worked as aircraft engineers during the First World War in Britain. It is important to note that these women only earned half of what their male counterparts earned. Many of the women worked as nurses and medics in hospitals along the fronts. Women worked as spies and informers near the fronts too, with some extraordinary stories, some of which I'll cover in future episodes. So, did the war forever change the role of women in society across Europe? Well, during the war, along with males who did not own property, women did not have the right to vote in most parts of the world. The suffragette movement was very active at this time, agitating for that right. In Britain, the Representation of the People's Act in 1918 finally granted women over 30 the right to vote, as did many other countries around Europe. Yet generally, apart from the vote, the role of women post-war shifted back to their role before the war. It was only after the Second World War that a more dramatic change occurred. Russia in 1917 saw the emergence of a number of women's battalions of death, some of which fought on the Eastern Front during the war. Many report that this is the first time that women fought alongside men in an equal capacity in the modern world, but this is not entirely true. In Ireland, which was part of the British Empire at the time, a very unique and forward-thinking army in terms of gender equality had emerged in Dublin, called the Irish Citizen Army. They were founded by James Connolly in 1913 in order to protect the striking workers from baton charges and killings from the police. The army was the first army to allow women to have a completely equal role to that of the men. They could take up leadership positions and carry rifles and fire their rifles. The Irish Citizen Army played a key role in the 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin, a rebellion to gain independence from Britain and declare Ireland a republic. Many women fought in the Irish Citizen Army during the Easter Rising. Two notable women worth mentioning here include Countess Markievicz, who was second in command at the Stephen's Green garrison in Dublin. She was sentenced to death for her part in the Rising, but managed to escape execution due to the fact that she was a woman. She later went on to become the first female ever elected to the British House of Commons in 1918. She refused to take her seat and sat on the outlawed Irish Republican Parliament in Dublin on the 21st of January 1919. Another woman worth mentioning is Margaret Skinner, a primary school teacher from Glasgow, who learned how to fire a rifle when the British began training some women during the war. She then used her talents in Dublin against the British in 1916, where she was positioned in the same garrison as Markievicz. She was apparently one of the most competent snipers and was a crack shot with a Lee Enfield rifle. She managed to escape back to Glasgow after the Rising, where she resumed her career teaching as a primary school teacher. And what about the women's battalions of death in Russia? The period between the February and October revolutions of 1917 witnessed the formation of men's battalions of death. These consisted of volunteer soldiers who were willing to die for Russia in order to inspire the rest of the Russian army to fight. See, this was at a time when there was complete demoralisation happening amongst the Russian ranks, with mass desertion and many soldiers refusing to fight. The Russian Provisional Government found itself then inundated with requests for the formation of similar women's battalions. Many argued that the creation of women's battalions of death, who were willing to literally fight to the death for Russia, would shame the men into fighting. There were mixed feelings in the Russian High Command in relation to this theory, but Minister for War Alexander Kerensky approved it, and it was also backed by the very capable and influential Russian general Alexei Brusilov, who himself was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Army in May of that year. In total, there were 15 women's formations formed. These included 4 battalions and 11 communications units. It is estimated that by the autumn of 1917, they numbered about 5,000, but only a maximum of 300 saw action on the front. One woman who was influential in all of this was a woman named Maria Bochkareeva, a semi-illiterate peasant girl from the Volga. In 1917, Bochkareeva was one of the most talked about women in Russia and the rest of Europe. So what was her story? In November 1914, at the age of 25, Bochkareeva attempted to enlist in the Russian 25th Reserve Battalion, in which she was refused on the grounds that she was a woman. She then managed to join the 28th Regiment of the Russian Second Army by attaining personal permission from the Tsar himself. She had no problem having her hair cropped like a man. In fact, she was described as being of stocky build, muscular and strong. She then trained in marksmanship and was stationed at Polotsk. She faced sexual harassment until she proved herself in battle, and boy did she prove herself. So much so that she was decorated twice. She received 2 degrees of the Cross of St. George for rescuing 50 wounded men in the field. She went on to become corporal, leading 11 men, and even later a non-commissioned officer. According to some sources, she was discharged in the spring of 1917 due to sexual harassment. It was during this time, between the February and October revolutions, that Bochkareeva attempted to muster up support for the creation of women's battalions of death. She herself petitioned a provisional government member, Mikhail Rodchenko, and he managed to persuade Kerensky, and with the added support of Brusilov, she was granted permission to form the first women's battalion of death in Petrograd. 2,000 women between the ages of 18 and 40 signed up on the first day after a rally led by Bochkareeva herself. But Bochkareeva was an authoritarian ruler, and within days that number had been reduced to less than 300. Bochkareeva dismissed women for refusing to take direct military orders, and she refused to allow the formation of Soviet military councils within her battalion, which had become the norm in the army at this time. This led to a huge drop in numbers. The women all had their hair cropped like the men and their possessions taken. They underwent intensive training by male soldiers from the Volinsky Regiment for up to 10 hours per day for a month. They wore the same uniform as the male battalions of death, which included the addition of a red and black cloth arrowhead. This signified that they were willing to die for their country. The only difference in equipment between the female and male battalions was that they were issued with carbine rifles, which were 5 pounds lighter than the regular rifles. After a month of training, they were sent to the Russian Western Front during the Kerensky offensive and occupied a trench near Smorgon, where Bochkareeva was promoted to lieutenant. As they marched to the front, they were supported by some women's group and jeered by others, especially anti-war groups and Bolsheviks. When they got to the front, the Russian army was in retreat, and many of the male soldiers were refusing to go over the top, so the women led the way. They advanced into German lines and took trenches there. In one trench, supposedly the women found vodka and attempted to destroy it before the men could drink it. I wonder why. Eventually, they had to fully retreat due to the lack of reserves, and they'd lost all the German land that they had gained in the offensive. Still, the commander of the battalion praised the women's initiative and bravery. There are conflicting reports about the amount of casualties Bochkareeva's battalion suffered at the front. She herself was wounded during the offensive. After the October Revolution, she became involved with the White Army and attempted numerous times to raise further women's battalions then. She travelled to America, where she had a meeting with Wilson requesting American interference in Russia. She even later had an audience with King George V in England, at which she requested British interference. And in May 1920, she was eventually executed by the Cheka as an enemy of the working class. In another famous episode involving a different female battalion, the 1st Petrograd Women's Battalion, they gained notoriety for their defence of the Winter Palace after the outbreak of the October Revolution. Many of the women, including their commander, actually refused to guard it, and those who did eventually surrendered as they were outnumbered by the superior pro-Bolshevik forces. There were allegations of mass rapes after the surrender, but only 3 women in interviews admitted that they had suffered sexual attacks. But there were many confirmed reports of verbal and physical abuse, including threats of sexual violence. Although these brave Russian women failed in their objective of shaming the men into fighting, they made international headlines and created a stir in the male-dominated political sphere of the time. The women of the Irish Citizen Army in Ireland and the women's battalions of death in Russia, although they were tiny minorities in both cases, deserve the respect of remembrance and recognition for the roles that they played. Do I think DICE made a good move by including women in this World War I game? Yes, as even though the women made up a tiny fraction of all combatants, they were there. They were volunteers as opposed to conscripts, and they fought and died. In my opinion, it is a very nice tribute by DICE, and I hope to see more of this in the future. What are your thoughts on the matter? Do you have any objection to the inclusion of female soldiers in the game? And remember, like and subscribe if you want more Battlefield 1 history-related videos. Stay tuned for more videos coming soon. Thanks, guys.